Back now to my interview with former Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Madeleine Albright. I talked to them this week in New Albany, Ohio, as part of the community's Jefferson series of lectures. Talk a little bit about what Russia is doing in Ukraine, because this whole scandal of the last few weeks, at the heart of it is a country, Ukraine, desperately trying to create its own independence, desperately trying to survive against a fairly constant barrage of Russian attacks.
Most countries don't change their geographical position. Russia did. But the bottom line is they are not as big and their economy's bad, but they are being run by a KGB officer. And he has a plan, which is how to undermine the democracies in Central and Eastern Europe and in other places. And I think we have to be aware of that. And Ukraine is the example of it, where it actually became taking land. And the question is how we react to it. They also are expanding their influence in the Middle East. All of a sudden, they are really players there. And I think that was a gift to them in this national security strategy to make them equivalent to China, but they really are out there militarizing information, trying to divide us from our allies, and I am concerned about what they're doing.
When the president froze the military aid to Ukraine, you know that struggle. Do you think the Ukrainians worried that something had changed, that American foreign policy had changed, or did they accept the president's argument as, oh, I was just trying to get the Europeans to give money as well?
Well, the thing that was interesting, I have to say, I thought the Obama administration didn't do enough about Ukraine, frankly. And so when the Trump people began to talk about doing something for Ukraine, I thought that was the right thing to do. It's very hard to tell how the Ukrainians interpreted it, and I think they did see it as, okay, so we're now back in the soup without any help. And the Russians are using a variety of ways to undermine the stability of the Ukrainians and generally, and I do think we need to watch out for that, and the fact that the president thinks that he can play with it in that particular way, I think is what is dangerous.
I certainly agree with Madeleine with respect to Russia and what it is doing, but it's mostly soft little touches. You know, they're doing military stuff in Syria, and there are other places they're doing things. But what they're doing with cybersecurity, what they were doing with those kinds of tools, is to gain influence around Europe and every place they can in Europe. And that's what the Chinese have been doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. They understand, but it is not just influence. That is an economic giant that they're putting in place. And it'll go from China all the way through the channel into London. And so they are doing things that are exciting, that are attracting people, buying them influence. Some of them are going broke with the Chinese deal that they get. But nevertheless, what is our equivalent to something like that? We're cutting foreign aid. We're cutting foreign aid because, you know, they don't contribute enough. Yes, they do. Or they don't give anything to Ukraine. We're the only ones. If you look at the numbers, our European friends and the IMF and others have given a lot more to Ukraine than we have. And so we've got to see this thing realistic and not always think that there's a war coming, but at the same time be ready for it. I always like to be ready for anything that comes along. But at the same time, let's use our common sense to see what really is good or not good.
What is the thing that gives you the most hope when you look around the world, when you look at America today? What is the thing that you hold on to?
In my book, and by the way, there's no speech or book ever written that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So in my book, I say, the older I am, the younger are my teacher. And what gives me hope are the young people. I think that they really are very forward-leaning, looking. Greta, the little Swedish girl, and what guts it took to go to the UN and tell them what jerks they are. And I know my students I find very interesting, and that they work hard. I think the thing that I would like to make sure of is that the young people are engaged, that they don't just think it will happen, that their smarts and their capabilities. So what gives me hope is the next generation.
Colin?
I have confidence in the American people. I've seen bad times in this country. This is not the worst time that I've lived through. I still think of when I was going to Vietnam the first time, President Kennedy was killed the day I came home on my first tour. 4 years later, Bobby Kennedy was killed and Martin Luther King was killed. We were losing a war in Vietnam. We were in a recession. We had race riots. We had drugs. We had all kinds of things going wrong. We were in a recession. If that wasn't bad enough, the Vice President of the United States resigned in disgrace. If that wasn't bad enough, the President of the United States resigned in disgrace. And the Soviet Union and China were sitting here saying, this is exactly what Lenin said would happen. But guess what? We returned to our basis. In came Jerry Ford, a simple Midwesterner who was never elected to be President of the United States. And he sort of stabilized us. He used to trip down steps a lot, but we loved it. You know, oh, Jerry, he's just like me, you know. He was one of us. And he stabilized the country, took a big risk by pardoning Nixon. And then Jimmy Carter came along, some difficulties, but we were now moving in the right direction. And then one of the presidents who I really, really treasure was Ronald Reagan. And he just came in and said, it's morning in America, you know?
It's morning again in America.
And we said, yes. And we sort of followed that. And we picked up the baton again. And we're going with it. But it's not what's happening now. Everything is a war. Everything is a fight. Everything is a disruption in Congress. Congress can't get its work done because it gets disrupted and they can't agree. And this is a dangerous time for us. But, you know, I believe in the American people. They have more judgment than we sometimes give them credit for, and they will fix it. As long as they know where to go to help fix it and how to get it done. And I think they have that inherent knowledge. And so I believe in us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.